Let's go ahead and pan to the audience for me. This is recording. Okay. All right. Hey guys, thank you for letting me speak to you all today. I'd like to talk about today who is the best basketball player of all time. It's April, the NBA playoffs have started off again, and it being one of the most popular sports in America, I thought this was an interesting topic to look at and dive into some of the statistics around it and everything else like that. And so to start off, for a long time, the debate was clouded. And then came around the 90s. And the person who was starting to emerge was obviously Michael Jordan. And everyone in the world has proclaimed him the greatest of all time, and it hasn't been until recently that there's even been someone that we've considered in the same light as him, and that's LeBron James. So off to my first slide here. Who are the main players? Well, it's pretty obvious. The main players are going to be LeBron James and Michael Jordan. They're around the only two guys that you can really compare statistically and appropriate for both time periods being similar. So if you look at LeBron James is a three-time champion. He has been selected to 13 All-NBA teams, and he has been the MVP of the league 4 years, and he is the only member of the 31,000 points, 3,000 rebounds, and 8,000 assist club, which has only been done once in history by him. And then on the other hand, you have Michael Jordan, the six-time champion who went 3 for 3 in two separate triple trips to the NBA Finals. He's an 11-time All-NBA player. He's a 5-time MVP, and he finished his career with 32,000 points, 5,600 assists, and 6,600 rebounds. So both of them have pretty compelling numbers, but to get more into this, you have to look at what's the advantages of one player over the other. So let's start with Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan has a lot of pros to his game, and one of the arguments that always gets brought up, which was brought up in the comedic movie Bad Teacher, when the adult teacher was arguing with the little kid who was a LeBron supporter, is 6 for 6 the only argument you have? And he responded, Sean, it's the only one I need. And for a lot of Michael Jordan fans, that's exactly right. He's 6 for 6, 100%. And so when you look at that, he did two separate three-peats in the NBA Finals, something that you don't ever see being done. Even when Magic and Larry Bird were tearing up the league, they couldn't do that because they kept running into each other. That's something LeBron's never been able to do. And the only team now that we can even see possibly achieving that is the Warriors. But they haven't done it yet. And part of the things that make Michael Jordan so special is some of the things that he would carry around with him. And that just attack attitude. Kind of like the Mamba attitude that Kobe adapted later. But the game that really emphasizes this is his flu game. The game where he has an over 100 fever, he's barely able to walk off the court, and yet it's in the middle of the playoffs, it's one of the most important games in the series, and he goes out and he scores 30-plus points, and he dominates the game. He looked at times like the only player on the court, and he's doing that with 102 fever, something that's just remarkable and part of the legend and the mythos that follows around Michael Jordan. And finally, we get to one of the last points, the Michael Jordan brand, Jumpman. You can't separate it from Michael Jordan because it is Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is one of the people who made basketball cool. It's said that Magic and Larry saved the league, but it was Michael Jordan who ended up making the league what it is today. And Forbes reported last year that from Nike, it was $1.65 billion at their evaluation, which is incredible. And especially if you think about it, Michael Jordan's been retired for almost 20 years now, and yet his brand still means so much. And for any of the basketball players in the room, I think we can all remember the first time we laced up our first pair of Jordans, and when we would wear them on the court, and it just made you feel better as a player if you had the Michael Jordan shoes. And it was that look. It was that sweatband on his arm. One of the first players to really end up doing that, the black socks, even the Bulls jerseys from that time period, that all build up the mythos of who he was and why he's still such a cultural influence. We see him now today still being so influential in everything that there is, and the Michael Jordan camp is one of the biggest camps that people love to go to if they're wanting to be a big prospect in the NBA games and for the college games. But all of that considered, he does have some flaws. And some of those flaws are his playoff inconsistencies. We all remember the 2 times that he went 3 times in a row to the finals and won, but we forget that he did have some playoff doubts. Early in his career, it seemed like he couldn't get past the Detroit Pistons and the Bad Boys, as shown in the documentary from ESPN, 30 for 30, Bad Boys. And with that, and then you see him also struggle against Larry Bird at the end of his career. And so there were some struggles even getting to the finals. He lost to the Orlando Magic early in one year in 91. But the other thing is he retired early. He had 2 separate retirements, and 3 in total, but 2 that he ended up coming back from. But those years that he lost are years that we can never get back. We just have to assume what he could have done. But him retiring in the middle of their hype after his 3rd championship, and everyone thought he was going to come back and win a 4th because he was already being proclaimed the best player of basketball of all time, but he retires. He takes off 18 months, and he tries his hand at baseball. And those years that we miss from him are years that we don't know what he could have done statistically. And maybe in some of those seasons it could have been astronomical what he could do. And him having 8 straight championships is a lot better than him having 6 on 2 different occasions of getting to 3 and 3. But all of that considered, let's move on to LeBron James and see what his argument is for being the greatest of all time. Again, as I've mentioned already, LeBron James is the only member of the 30,000 point, 8,000 rebounds, and 8,000 assists, and that's the player who LeBron is. He's a stat monster, and he takes over some games. He holds the record for the most playoff points and the most playoff wins, which, when considering the argument of, hey, do you win games and are you the most important for your team, he's the number 1 guy in both of those categories. And he's also been now to 8 straight trips to the NBA Finals, which is unheard of. Entire teams haven't been able to do that. The last people who were able to do that were the Celtics back in the 50s and 60s when there were 8 teams in the NBA and segregation laws were still restricting from African American players to even enter the league. That was led by Bill Russell and a few other old guys like that. The main thing with LeBron is a lot of the cons that carry with it. And the reason why is probably because he's still a newer player and he's still playing today. And some of those are, he's 3-6 record in the finals. It's not a very good record when you consider the guy you're arguing up against is 100% in the NBA Finals, and you're 33%. And when people look at that, they instantly assume, yo, LeBron, you don't got this. If you only have 3, we aren't going to consider that. And one of the losses in the finals was to the Dallas Mavericks, which really haunts him because that was his 2nd trip to there. That was his first season on the Miami Heat when they had Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, so a very talented team, and he froze. The first 2 games of the series, it looked like they were going to sweep it. They were up 2-0, and then they went to Dallas, and then leaving Dallas, it's now 2-2. And from then on, LeBron was a non-factor in the series. And people assumed after that, well, there goes LeBron. There's no case for him anymore because of that big freeze on that big moment. And another thing that he has to deal with is the new age media. The fact that he has to deal with Twitter, and he has to deal with Facebook, and he has to deal with Instagram, and all of the drama that follows that anyone who watches any of the sports talk shows discuss all the time, that Michael Jordan never had to deal with. When Michael Jordan was there, it was radio talk shows still, and it was ESPN highlight clips. He never had to deal with the added media of everyone always being involved in your business. And some of the stuff that he says is polarizing to some people. And they don't like the fact that this small kid from Akron at 18 got a tattoo calling himself the chosen one. And his free throw line. When considering the greatest player of all time, you don't like to think of a guy who averaged 70% from the free throw line instead of someone like Michael Jordan, who's high 80s to low 90s consistently throughout his career. At the end of the game, you want your best player taking that shot, and if he goes to the free throw line and ends up putting up 2 misses, that's not what you want from your greatest player of all time. But all of this considered, I think the choice is pretty easy. I think that it's LeBron. And it's an unpopular opinion, I know. But what's important is that we forget a lot of things. We forget about Michael Jordan's struggles in the playoffs. The loss that he had to the Orlando Magic is a pretty big one. I mean, Shaquille O'Neal at the time is still a really young guy, and they didn't really have an answer for him, and in that series, you just wouldn't think that Michael would lose. Yet he did. And we forget that Michael Jordan's championships came while the NBA was expanding. During his first three-peat, 4 teams were added to the league. So when you have the Minnesota Timberwolves taking players off of the fading Boston Celtics and the fading Lakers, and you have the Miami Heat taking people away, and you have the Toronto Raptors and the Memphis Grizz, it makes it to where the rest of the league is a little bit less competitive. So the best player of all time, arguably, could end up taking over the league a little bit easier if the rest of the league is getting weaker by it expanding. And then nobody likes to admit that LeBron has played tougher people. He's had to go through more adversity. He's had to go through better coaches, and he's never had a great coach with him. And Michael Jordan played at a time when the rest of the guys in the league weren't all that good. Take last year's series, for example. LeBron had to go up against 4 NBA All-Stars on one team, possibly the best team ever assembled. If you look at it, even Michael Jordan's team, who's considered the best team of all time, that 72-10 team, only had 3 All-Stars, and he went up against 4. The Defensive Player of the Year, statistically, with Steph Curry, the best three-point shooter ever, and with Kevin Durant, the best small forward shooter ever now considered. And Michael Jordan played up against John Stockton, a 6'3" white guy, and Malone, whose nickname was the Postman, and never ended up winning even when Michael retired twice. And Charles Barkley, who's a great commentator on TNT, but if you look at his NBA playoff record, it's not very good. And it's not like they didn't have chances. He retired twice, and those guys still never got it done in the finals. And when you look at that, it does make his 6-for-6 championships look a little bit flawed. And as discussed earlier, LeBron has the better statistics. And if he has the better statistics, and if the one thing that's still keeping Michael Jordan above LeBron is his 6-for-6 championships, well, if you look at it, it's not as impressive as it seems on paper. And that's something that a lot of people forget, is this stuff, which no one talks about, which is why I think that LeBron is the best player. And as Nick Wright likes to say on Undisputed, LeBron's cement is still wet. You can still see all the imperfections. But you don't see those imperfections on Michael Jordan, because his cement's dry. And all of the imperfections have now been paved over. And we don't like to look at the mistakes that he had, because for a lot of the NBA analysis right now, he was their childhood. People who are now the 30, 40 age, and even a little bit older, this is a guy that they grew up watching with Michael Jordan. And the fact that someone's trying to take over that reign is a little sketchy, and you don't like to see your childhood superstars start to falter and start to not look like the proclaimed best player of all time. And that's why I think LeBron's the best. Because in 20 years, when his cement is dry and he's been retired for 15-plus years, we're all going to look back on his career and remember the 60-point game in Boston. Or we'll remember the fact that he took a down 3-1 team of Cleveland and took them and won the championship against arguably one of the best teams of all time. And so thank you all for listening to my presentation. And is there any questions that anybody would like answered? No? All right. Yes, Katie. Because he's largely considered light Mike. And the reason why is because a lot of the game that he has is exactly Michael Jordan. And it's arguable that you can say, well, all of his championships he had to have one coach with him. And he had to have Shaquille O'Neal with him. He had to run the triangle offense that Michael Jordan perfected. And he shoots worse than LeBron. He doesn't have as many rebounds as LeBron, or as many assists as LeBron. So I didn't consider him in the argument. Any other questions? No? All right. Thank you all for listening.